An immigrant helped an old man, not realizing he'd be offered a life-changing job. The words echoed in Elias Nazari's mind as he stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of his one-room apartment. The irony wasn't lost on him. All his life, he had been the one extending his hand to others. Yet here he stood, 27 years old, thousands of miles from home, with calloused hands that spoke of endless labor and shoulders that carried the invisible weight of displacement. Outside, Boston's winter howled with particular cruelty. 3 months since he'd arrived in America, and Elias still hadn't adjusted to this cold. A cold that seeped past clothes, past skin, settling somewhere deeper. He wrapped his thin scarf tighter around his neck, a poor defense against the biting chill that awaited him beyond his door. The apartment, if one could dignify it with that name, was barely large enough for his fold-out cot and the small hot plate where he prepared his meals. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors' lives unfolding around him. Arguments, laughter, crying children, television shows in languages he sometimes recognized from his travels. Today, like most days, he would leave before dawn and return well after dark, chasing the elusive promise that had drawn him across oceans. Opportunity. Elias splashed water on his face, the pipes groaning in protest. His dark eyes looked back at him, carrying the same quiet determination that had sustained him through the journey from Iran. The revolution, the loss of his father's engineering business, his mother's tears as she pressed their family's last valuable, her gold wedding band, into his palm before he left. These memories were constant companions, whispering reminders of why failure wasn't an option. Today will be different, he murmured to himself in Farsi, a daily ritual that helped him face the mountain of uncertainty each morning brought. He wasn't entirely sure how it would be different, but hope was the one luxury he permitted himself. By 5:30 a.m., Elias was already at the corner of Commonwealth Avenue, stamping his feet against the cold as he waited with the other day laborers. Most were like him, immigrants from dozens of countries, men with education and skills in their homelands, reduced to raising their hands when contractors drove by looking for cheap labor. They barely acknowledged each other, each lost in their private struggles, though a nod here and there conveyed the silent understanding that bound them. A white pickup truck slowed. The window rolled down, revealing a red-faced man in a construction hat. Need 3 today. Hard work, basement demolition. Hands shot up. Elias raised his alongside them, making brief eye contact with the contractor. He'd learned that looking directly at them sometimes made a difference. A small reminder of humanity in a transaction designed to strip it away. The man pointed at 2 others, then at Elias. You, and you. $12 an hour, cash at the end of the day. Relief washed over him. Not all days brought work. Some men had been standing on this corner for a week without being chosen. $12 an hour meant he could make his rent payment, buy groceries, and perhaps add a few dollars to the envelope he was saving to bring his younger sister to America. Mariam was brilliant. She deserved more than the limited future Iran offered a young woman with dreams of becoming a doctor. The day unfolded as countless others had before it. The basement was damp and dark, filled with decades of accumulated junk. The 3 chosen men worked methodically, carrying heavy furniture, old appliances, and countless boxes up narrow stairs to a dumpster. By noon, Elias's back screamed in protest, but he worked steadily, pausing only when absolutely necessary. During a brief water break, his phone buzzed. A text from his roommate, Javier. Landry says rent due tomorrow. Full amount this time. Elias's stomach tightened. Mr. Landry, their landlord, had been somewhat flexible the previous month when Elias was short, but his patience was clearly running thin. Even with today's work, he would still be $30 short. The afternoon dragged on, the basement seemingly endless in its contents. As the light outside began to fade, the contractor appeared at the top of the stairs. That's enough for today. Come back tomorrow to finish. He counted out cash for each man. As Elias pocketed his earnings, he calculated quickly. 1 more day might be enough to cover rent completely. A small victory. By the time he headed home, night had fully descended, bringing with it a snowfall that transformed the city into something softer, quieter. The flakes clung to his eyelashes as he walked, too tired to hurry despite the cold. His route took him through the historic Beacon Hill neighborhood, a shortcut he often used, though the contrast between the elegant townhomes and his own circumstances sometimes felt like salt in a wound. 3 blocks from the T station, Elias noticed an elderly man struggling on the icy sidewalk. The man had a cane, but it slipped repeatedly on the slick surface. and the grocery bag in his other hand seemed to throw off his balance further. Even from a distance, Elias could see the man's breath coming in short, anxious clouds. He should keep walking. The tea would stop running soon, and he needed to get home to count his money, to figure out how to appease Mr. Landry until tomorrow's pay came through. He had his own problems, plenty of them, yet his feet changed direction of their own accord, moving toward the old man. "Excuse me, sir," Elias said, his accent thick but his English clear enough. "May I help you with that bag?" The old man looked up, startled. He had a dignified face etched with deep lines, pale blue eyes sharp beneath heavy brows dusted with snowflakes. He wore an expensive-looking wool coat that had seen better years, and a knitted scarf wrapped meticulously around his neck. "I'm quite capable," the man said, his voice carrying the particular pride of the elderly, determined to maintain independence. As if to demonstrate, he took another step, and his cane immediately slid on a patch of black ice. Elias moved quickly, catching the man's elbow before he could fall. The grocery bag dropped, spilling its contents across the sidewalk. Oranges rolled in different directions. A carton of eggs smashed open, and a loaf of bread landed in a snowbank. "Damnation," the old man muttered, a flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. Elias immediately knelt down, gathering what could be salvaged. "It's no problem. I'll get these for you." He collected the oranges, brushing snow off the bread, and placed them back in the bag. The eggs were beyond saving. "I'm very sorry about your eggs," Elias said, standing and offering the bag back to the man. "Do you live far? I can carry this for you." The old man studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, 2 blocks. The blue door with the brass knocker." He hesitated, then added with obvious reluctance, "I would appreciate the assistance." They walked slowly, the old man setting a deliberate pace, careful of his footing. Elias matched his steps, occasionally offering his arm for stability when they encountered particularly slippery patches. "You're not from here," the man said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir. I am from Iran. I have been in Boston for 3 months. And what brings you to our fair city in the dead of winter? Most people have the sense to arrive in spring." There was a hint of dry humor in the question that surprised Elias. "I did not have much choice in the timing. When the visa comes, you go." The man nodded. "Sensible. And what did you do in Iran before you came here to help old men with their groceries?" "I was an architectural engineer," Elias said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. He rarely had occasion to mention his former profession. "Or I was studying to be one. 2 semesters left when I had to leave." "Architectural engineering," the man repeated thoughtfully. "Structural integrity, load-bearing calculations, the bones of buildings." Elias glanced at him, surprised. "You know something of the field?" "I know something of many fields," the man replied enigmatically. "Here we are." They stopped in front of a handsome townhouse, its blue door exactly as described. Elias stood awkwardly, unsure of protocol. Should he hand over the bag and leave? "Help the man inside? Would you like to come in for tea?" the old man asked, his tone making it unclear whether it was a genuine invitation or a formality he expected to be declined. Elias thought of his apartment, of the money he needed to count, of tomorrow's early start. "I would like that very much," he heard himself say. The old man's name, Elias learned as they settled in the warmth of a book-lined study, was Henry Whitaker. The house belonged to him, had been in his family for generations, and despite its immaculate appearance from the outside, the interior revealed signs of neglect. Water stains on the ceiling, peeling wallpaper in corners, a persistent draft from the windows. "Maintenance becomes a burden at my age," Henry explained, pouring tea into delicate cups that looked as if they belonged in a museum. "And good help is surprisingly difficult to find, even when one can pay for it." Elias warmed his hands around the cup, feeling oddly at ease in this strange setting. The room smelled of old books and wood polish, with undertones of something medicinal that he associated with the elderly. "How old are you, Mr. Whitaker?" he asked, immediately regretting the directness of the question. But Henry just smiled faintly. 82 next month. And too old to waste time pretending age isn't relevant. He settled into a high-back leather chair with a slight wince. "And you? You have the face of someone older than your years." 27, Elias replied. "Sometimes it feels like more." They sipped their tea in companionable silence for a moment. Henry's eyes, despite his age, were alert and evaluating. "Tell me," Henry said suddenly, "if you were to look at this house with your architectural engineer's eye, what would you see?" Elias set down his cup, surprised by the question. "Do you want me to be honest? I've found at my age that dishonesty is a luxury with diminishing returns." Elias nodded and looked around with more attention. "The structure itself is sound. These old Boston homes were built to last centuries. But there is water damage that needs addressing before it compromises the integrity. The windows need resealing. I feel drafts. And he hesitated. Go on, Henry encouraged. The floor beneath your chair is sagging slightly. I would guess a support beam in the basement needs reinforcement. Henry's eyebrows rose. Impressive. The last contractor I hired spent 3 hours here and missed the floor issue entirely. He set his cup down with a decisive click. What's your name? I don't believe you mentioned it. Elias Nazari. Well, Mr. Nazari, I find myself in need of someone with your particular skill set. My regular handyman retired to Florida last spring. A terrible mistake. The humidity will be the death of him, and I've had a parade of incompetence through here since. Would you be interested in addressing some of these issues? I pay fairly and promptly. Elias blinked, caught completely off guard. I am not a licensed contractor in this country. I'm not asking for permits or paperwork. I'm asking if you can fix my drafty windows and shore up my floor before I fall through it some evening while reaching for Dickens. The offer was unexpected, tempting. Work that utilized at least some of his skills, potentially better pay than hauling debris from basements. But Elias had learned caution. What exactly would the job entail? And the payment? He asked, careful to keep his tone neutral despite the hope flickering to life. Henry outlined a list of repairs. Windows, minor carpentry, patching the ceiling, investigating the basement supports, and named a figure that made Elias struggle to maintain his composure. It was triple what he could make as a day laborer. That is very generous, he said carefully. It's market rate for skilled work, Henry corrected. I may be old, but I don't exploit people because they lack documentation or options. He regarded Elias steadily. Can you start tomorrow? Say 9 o'clock? I committed to finishing a job tomorrow, Elias said, thinking of the basement demolition. But I could come after, perhaps 3 o'clock. A man who honors his commitments. How refreshing. Henry nodded approvingly. 3 o'clock is acceptable. As Elias stood to leave, Henry walked him to the door with his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the hardwood floors. Mr. Nazari, he said as Elias stepped onto the porch. I should warn you that I'm considered something of a difficult employer. I have exacting standards. Elias smiled for the first time that evening. My father was an engineer who quoted Persian poetry when measurements were off by millimeters. I understand exacting standards. A surprised laugh escaped Henry, brief but genuine. Then perhaps we'll suit each other. Gah. Good night, Mr. Nazari. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. The snow had stopped, leaving the world hushed in white. As Elias made his way to the tea station, his mind raced with calculations. If he worked for Henry 3 days a week while maintaining his other jobs, he could send for Miriam in months rather than years. The thought made his steps lighter despite his exhaustion. For the first time since arriving in America, Elias felt the faintest flicker of what might be called luck. He wasn't naive enough to believe it would last. Life had taught him better lessons. But tonight, walking through the quiet, snow-blanketed streets, he allowed himself to hope. The following day moved at an excruciating pace. Elias returned to the basement demolition with renewed energy, working efficiently enough that the contractor raised his eyebrows and muttered something about getting his money's worth. By 2:30, they had finished clearing the space, and Elias collected his pay with barely contained impatience. He stopped at a hardware store on his way to Henry's, spending a careful portion of his earnings on a few basic tools. The investment felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a commitment to this unexpected opportunity, a statement to himself that he believed it was real. Henry answered the door at precisely 3 o'clock, looking much as he had the previous evening, except that he wore reading glasses perched on the end of his nose and held a newspaper folded under one arm. Punctual, he noted approvingly. Come in. I've prepared a list. The list, it turned out, was 4 pages long, written in a precise hand that belied Henry's age. Elias read through it carefully, mentally categorizing each task by urgency and difficulty. This window in the study should be first, he said, pointing to an item midway through the second page. The draft could make you ill in this weather. Henry studied him with that evaluating gaze. Prioritizing my health over the more visible repairs. Interesting. The visible repairs matter too. Elias said, but not if you catch pneumonia before they're completed. A smile flickered across Henry's face. Well reasoned. The study window it is. They fell into an unexpected rhythm over the following days. Elias would arrive at 3 and work until evening, moving methodically through Henry's list. The old man would sit nearby reading, occasionally offering commentary or asking questions about Elias's methods. Sometimes he would disappear for hours, only to return with tea, or once, surprisingly, good homemade soup. "My late wife's recipe," he explained when Elias complimented it. "After 53 years of marriage, one picks up a few culinary skills, if only for survival." That casually mentioned wife was one of the few personal details Henry volunteered. He was otherwise private, though observant. He noted when Elias skipped lunch, when he seemed particularly tired, when a certain repair made him frown in concentration. As for Elias, he found himself looking forward to these afternoons. The work itself was satisfying, a return to problem-solving, to creating rather than destroying. And Henry, despite his initial warning about being difficult, proved to be a thoughtful employer. He was particular, yes, but also appreciative of quality work and surprisingly flexible about methods. 2 weeks into this arrangement, as Elias was carefully resealing the third window in the study, Henry cleared his throat. "I understand you send money home," he said without preamble. Elias's hand stilled. "Yes, to my mother and sister. And you're saving to bring your sister here?" It wasn't a question. Elias turned, surprised. "How did you know? You count your pay very carefully before putting some aside in that envelope in your bag. And you mentioned she wants to be a doctor. America would offer better opportunities." Henry folded his newspaper deliberately. "What's her name?" "Mariam." Elias returned to the window, oddly moved by the inquiry. "She's brilliant, just 18 but already speaking 3 languages. In Iran, though, her options are limited." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "My wife and I never had children," he said finally. "Elizabeth wanted them, but it wasn't to be. She used to say that was why I was so particular about everything. No children to disrupt my perfect order." Elias wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected confidence. "I'm sorry. Don't be. We had a good life together." Henry tapped his cane thoughtfully against the floor. "But I find myself at 81 with a large house, considerable resources, and no one to leave them to. It's an odd position." Elias remained silent, sensing that Henry was working his way towards something. "The windows are much improved," Henry said, changing the subject abruptly. "Start on the kitchen cabinets tomorrow, would you? They're hanging crooked, and Elizabeth would never have tolerated such slovenliness in her kitchen." The following afternoon, when Elias arrived, Henry was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers before him. "Before you begin on the cabinets," he said, "I have a proposition for you." Elias set down his tools, wary. "What kind of proposition?" "This house has 4 bedrooms. I occupy one. The others gather dust." Henry's fingers drummed once on the tabletop. "The 3rd floor has its own bathroom and a small sitting area. It's essentially a private apartment, though it lacks a kitchen." "Are you offering me a place to stay?" Elias asked carefully. "I'm offering you a live-in position," Henry corrected. "Reduced pay, but room and board included. You'd have the 3rd floor to yourself, access to the kitchen, and significantly more time to work through that monstrosity of a list I've created." Elias stood very still, processing. The offer was unexpected, potentially life-changing. No more crowded apartment with thin walls and unreliable heat. No more long commutes on the T. But also, why? He asked directly. "You barely know me." Henry met his gaze steadily. "I know that you're skilled, reliable, and honest. I know that you honor your commitments. I know that this house needs far more work than you can accomplish in a few hours each afternoon." He paused. "And I know that living alone in this place at my age is increasingly impractical, though I'm loath to admit it." The last admission seemed to cost him something. Henry straightened in his chair, as if physically pushing back against the vulnerability of the moment. "Consider it mutually beneficial," he continued briskly. "You need affordable housing, I need consistent help. You have skills, I have space. It's a practical arrangement." But there was something in his eyes that spoke of more than practicality. A hint of loneliness, perhaps, or the weight of too many silent evenings in rooms built for family. "I would need to think about it," Elias said. "Of course. Take a day. The offer remains open." Henry pushed his chair back. "Now about those cabinets." That night, in his cramped apartment, Elias weighed his options carefully. The practical benefits were clear. No rent to pay, more consistent work, the safety and comfort of a proper home. He could save more quickly for Miriam's passage. But living in Henry's house would mean a different kind of commitment, something beyond employee and employer. Javier found him calculating figures on a scrap of paper. "Hot water's out again," his roommate announced, dropping onto the folding chair across from Elias. Landlord says maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. He nodded toward Elias's calculations. What's all that? You look serious, man. Elias explained Henry's offer. Javier whistled low. Private floor in a Beacon Hill house? Take it before the old man changes his mind. It's not that simple, Elias said. Living there, I would be responsible for him, in a way. If he fell ill, if he needed help in the night. So, you're already helping everyone else. Javier gestured around at their dismal surroundings. This place is killing you slowly, my friend. I see how you look when you come home each night, like your soul is being squeezed dry. Elias smiled faintly. Very poetic. I'm Mexican. Poetry is in our blood, along with good tequila and bad decisions. Javier became serious. Listen, opportunities like this don't come along often for people like us. If the old man seems decent, if you think you can trust him, take the chance. The next day, Elias arrived at Henry's with his decision made. I accept your offer, he said simply. When would you want me to move in? Relief flickered briefly across Henry's face before it settled back into its usual composed expression. Whenever is convenient. The room is ready. This weekend, then, Elias suggested. This weekend would be suitable. They regarded each other for a moment, both seemingly aware that something significant had shifted between them, though neither quite ready to acknowledge it. I'll start on the cabinets now, Elias said finally. Henry nodded, reaching for his newspaper. Yes, the cabinets. Saturday morning found Elias standing on the sidewalk outside Henry's. No, his new home, with 2 suitcases containing everything he owned in the world. The reality of what he was doing suddenly hit him with full force. He was moving into a stranger's house, binding his life to an elderly man he'd known for less than a month. It was either the wisest or the most foolish decision he'd made since coming to America. Before he could reconsider, the blue door opened and Henry appeared. Are you planning to stand there contemplating the architecture all day? Or would you like to come inside where it's warm? He called. Elias smiled despite his anxiety and picked up his suitcases. Henry insisted on giving a formal tour, though Elias had seen most of the house during his repairs. It was different, though, seeing it as a home rather than a workplace. He noticed details he'd missed before: photographs in silver frames, books with well-worn spines, a collection of antique clocks that Henry wound with meticulous care. This one was my grandfather's, Henry explained, touching a particularly ornate timepiece. Brought over from England in 1889. Still keeps perfect time, provided it's wound properly. The third floor, when they reached it, exceeded Elias's expectations. The small sitting area Henry had mentioned was a charming space with a bay window overlooking the street, complete with a comfortable armchair and a small writing desk. The bedroom was simply but elegantly furnished with a 4-poster bed and a mahogany dresser. The bathroom, though old-fashioned with its clawfoot tub, was spotlessly clean. It's beautiful, Elias said honestly. Far nicer than anywhere I've stayed since coming to America. Henry looked pleased despite his attempt at nonchalance. It hasn't been used in years. It will be good to have the space occupied again. As Elias unpacked his meager belongings, he felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. The opportunity before him was remarkable, but the potential for disappointment, his or Henry's, was equally significant. He carefully placed his family photograph on the bedside table. His mother, his father before his death, Miriam as a child, and himself at 20, still unaware of how dramatically his life would change. That evening, without discussion, they ate dinner together in Henry's formal dining room. Elias had offered to cook, but Henry waved him off. Mrs. Patterson brings meals twice a week, he explained. She's been doing it since Elizabeth died, claiming I would starve otherwise. Pure fiction, I'm perfectly capable of feeding myself. But her cooking is superior to mine, so I permit the arrangement. The meal, a hearty beef stew with fresh bread, was indeed excellent. They ate mostly in silence, though not an uncomfortable one. Occasionally, Henry would make an observation about the weather or ask a question about a repair Elias had completed. It was, Elias realized with surprise, the most peaceful dinner he'd had in months. After they'd finished, Henry poured 2 small glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. Brandy? He said, pushing one toward Elias. A small tradition I maintain. Elizabeth always said a day should end with warmth. Elias wasn't much of a drinker, but he accepted the glass, understanding the gesture for what it was. A welcome, in Henry's restrained way. To new arrangements, Henry said, raising his glass slightly. To new arrangements, Elias echoed, taking a small sip. The brandy burned pleasantly down his throat, warming him from within. As the days turned into weeks, they established routines. Elias would rise early, make breakfast for them both, after discovering that Henry's idea of breakfast was black coffee and occasionally a piece of toast, then work through the seemingly endless list of repairs until late afternoon. Evenings were his own, though increasingly he found himself joining Henry in the study, each absorbed in their own reading but sharing the comfortable silence. Sometimes they talked. Henry, it turned out, had been a professor of architectural history at Harvard before his retirement, which explained his knowledge of Elias's field. He had traveled extensively in his younger years, including to Iran in the 1960s. A different country then, he remarked. Beautiful. I remember the mosques in Isfahan, mathematical precision translated into transcendence. Your people understood the divinity of geometry long before the West. Elias, in turn, told Henry about his family, his education, the revolution that had upended his plans, and his dreams for Miriam's future. He found himself speaking more freely than he had with anyone since arriving in America, perhaps because Henry listened with genuine interest, without the pity or discomfort that often colored such conversations. One evening in late February, as a snowstorm raged outside, Henry emerged from his study with a large roll of papers. "I've been meaning to show you these," he said, spreading them carefully on the dining table. They were the original architectural drawings of the house, dated 1847, beautifully detailed and surprisingly well preserved. "These are extraordinary," Elias breathed, leaning closer to examine the precise line work. "Where did you find them?" "They were Elizabeth's discovery, actually. She found them in the attic shortly after we moved in, hidden behind a false wall. She had them properly preserved." Henry's finger traced a particular detail. "See here?" The original architect included a small courtyard that was later enclosed to create what's now the kitchen extension. Elizabeth always wanted to restore it, have a bit of garden space within the house, but we never got around to it. Elias studied the drawings with professional admiration. It could still be done. The load-bearing elements are separate from that addition. With proper planning, do you think so? Something like excitement animated Henry's usually composed features. Elizabeth would have loved that. She always said this house needed more light. That night, unable to sleep, Elias found himself sketching at the small desk in his sitting area, reimagining the enclosed courtyard as Elizabeth might have wanted it. It was a creative exercise he hadn't allowed himself in months, and it awakened something long dormant. The pleasure of design, of envisioning spaces not just for function, but for joy. When he showed the sketches to Henry the next morning, the old man studied them in silence for so long that Elias began to worry he'd overstepped. "I apologize if I presumed," he began. "No," Henry interrupted, looking up with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. "These are remarkable. You've captured exactly what Elizabeth described wanting, right down to the built-in planters for herbs." He set the sketches down carefully. "You have a gift, Mr. Hazzetti. One that shouldn't be wasted on fixing my drafty windows." "I don't mind the windows," Elias said. "It's honest work." "Honest, yes, but not your work." Henry tapped the sketches. "This is your work. Creating, not just repairing." The words struck something deep in Elias, a recognition of truth he'd been avoiding. In his determination to survive, to be practical, he'd set aside the part of himself that dreamed of designing spaces that elevated the human experience. It seemed an impossible luxury now, that dream. "Perhaps someday," he said quietly. Henry gave him a long, evaluating look. "Perhaps sooner than you think." The following week brought a shift in their routine. Henry announced at breakfast that he had invited colleagues for dinner. Former students, now professors themselves. "They check on me periodically like clockwork, to ensure I haven't expired among my books." Elias offered to make himself scarce for the evening, but Henry waved away the suggestion. "Nonsense. I've told them about you. They're intrigued by our arrangement." A faint smile. "And by your background. Richard teaches contemporary Middle Eastern architecture. He'll talk your ear off if you let him." The prospect of meeting Henry's academic colleagues filled Elias with a strange anxiety. These would be educated people, successful in their fields, comfortable in their American identities. What would they make of him, the immigrant handyman living in their former professor's attic? He spent the day unusually distracted, double-checking measurements and rereading instructions for a bathroom tile repair. By late afternoon, he found himself changing shirts twice, trying to find one without paint stains or worn cuffs. The guests, Richard and his wife Amelia, and another former student named Catherine, arrived promptly at 7. They were exactly as Elias had imagined. Well-dressed, articulate, carrying expensive wine, and moving through Henry's house with the ease of frequent visitors. Catherine spotted the architectural drawings still laid out on a side table. "Are these the originals, Henry? Bringing out the treasures tonight, are we?" "Actually," Henry said, "those are Elias's sketches, a reimagining of the original courtyard design." The three visitors gathered around the sketches with immediate interest. Richard put on reading glasses to examine them more closely. "These are excellent," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "The integration of modern materials while maintaining the historical integrity. Very thoughtful work." "You studied architecture in Iran?" Catherine asked, turning to Elias. "Architectural engineering," he corrected, "at the University of Tehran. I didn't complete my degree." "The revolution," Richard murmured knowingly. "A terrible loss for Iranian higher education. Some of the finest minds in the field." "Richard," Henry interrupted dryly, "spare us the lecture this evening. I believe dinner's ready." Throughout the meal, Elias found himself drawn into discussions that awakened his intellectual side. Debates about preservation versus modernization, the challenges of urban housing, the influence of climate on design traditions. These were conversations he'd been starved for without realizing it. The guest treated his opinions with respect, even interest. And by the time dessert was served, he had almost forgotten to be anxious about his place at the table. After the guests departed, Henry lingered in the dining room, swirling the last of his brandy thoughtfully. "They were impressed by you," he said. "Catherine especially. She heads the continuing education program at the Boston Architectural College." Elias began gathering dishes. "They were kind." "Not kind. Impressed. There's a difference." Henry's gaze was direct. "Catherine mentioned that BAC has a path for foreign-educated professionals to complete American credentials. Flexible scheduling designed for working adults." Elias stilled, dishes in hand. "Did she?" "Indeed. She suggested you might consider applying. Said she'd be happy to review your transcripts." The offer hung in the air between them. Elias resumed clearing the table, his mind racing. The possibility had never occurred to him that he might continue his education here, complete what had been interrupted in Iran. It seemed simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant. "Something to consider," Henry said, rising from his chair with the aid of his cane. No rush to decide. But the seed had been planted, and in the following days, Elias found himself researching the program Catherine had mentioned. The tuition was steep but not entirely prohibitive, especially with his reduced expenses living at Henry's. The flexible schedule would allow him to continue working. It was possible, difficult, but possible. One evening in early March, as a hesitant spring began to assert itself against winter's lingering chill, Henry called Elias into his study. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about the courtyard design." "Yes." Elias had continued refining the sketches in his spare time, unable to let go of the project. "I'd like to build it. Or rather, I'd like you to build it." Elias blinked in surprise. "That would be a major renovation, Mr. Whitaker, far beyond fixing windows and cabinets." "I'm aware," Henry said dryly. "I may be old, but my cognitive facilities remain intact." "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Henry waved away the apology. "The point is, I have the resources to undertake this project. What I lack is time." At 82, one becomes acutely aware of the finite nature of existence. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly at what Elias had come to recognize as arthritic pain. Elizabeth wanted this courtyard. For 40 years, she spoke of light and growing things in this dark old house. "I always said later, after tenure, after the book was published, after the kitchen was remodeled." Later never came for her. A shadow passed over his face. "I'd like to see it completed while I can still enjoy it." A tribute of sorts. The project would be challenging, requiring permits, professional contractors for certain aspects, significant disruption to the house. But as Elias considered it, he realized it was exactly the kind of work he had been trained for. Managing a complex architectural project, solving problems, creating something beautiful and functional. "It would be an honor," he said simply. Henry nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Good. We'll begin planning tomorrow." The courtyard project transformed their relationship in subtle but significant ways. They became partners of a sort, with Elias managing the day-to-day details and Henry providing guidance based on his historical knowledge of the house. They spent evenings poring over materials catalogs, debating the merits of different skylights, considering how best to incorporate Elizabeth's desire for herb planters. As the plans progressed from sketches to formal drawings to permit applications, Elias found himself using skills he'd feared were atrophying. His English improved as he negotiated with suppliers and interviewed contractors. His confidence grew as decisions he made were validated by successful outcomes. Henry, too, seemed energized by the project. Though he complained about the dust and disruption when construction finally began in April, Elias often found him watching the progress with barely concealed excitement. On the day the first section of roof was removed and light flooded into what would become the courtyard, Henry stood in the center of the space for a long time, face tilted up toward the sky. Elizabeth would have loved this moment, he said quietly. She always said this house needed to breathe. By early summer, the courtyard was taking shape. The new glass roof was installed, the stone flooring laid, the built-in planters constructed. Elias had designed a small fountain for one corner, its gentle sound filling the space with a sense of tranquility. Greenery began to soften the stone and brick. Ferns, ivy, the herbs Elizabeth had wanted. It was during this period that Elias also, with Catherine's guidance, applied to the Boston Architectural College's special program for international professionals. His transcripts from Tehran were evaluated. His experience, including the courtyard project, was considered relevant professional practice. When the acceptance letter arrived in June, Henry insisted on opening a bottle of champagne. A proper celebration is required, he declared, expertly popping the cork. Educational milestones should never go unmarked. As they sipped champagne in the nearly completed courtyard, surrounded by the transformation they had created together, Elias felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since leaving Iran. This house, with its history and character and stubborn old owner, had somehow become home. "I've been thinking," Henry said, setting down his glass. "Your sister, Mariam, you mentioned she wants to study medicine." "Yes," Elias said, surprised by the sudden change of topic. "It's been her dream since childhood. Harvard Medical School has an international scholarship program. Highly competitive, of course, but for exceptional students." He let the statement hang. "Mariam is exceptional," Elias said. "But such opportunities, they're not for people like us." "Nonsense," Henry said sharply. "They're precisely for people like your sister. Brilliant minds who would otherwise be lost to circumstance." He hesitated, then added more gently, "I know people on the admissions committee. From former colleagues. They could ensure her application receives proper consideration." Elias stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. You would do that? Help someone you've never met?" "I would help your sister," Henry corrected. "There's a difference." He refilled their glasses with a steady hand. "We should consider the guest room on the second floor for her. The morning light there is excellent for studying." The casual presumption that Mariam would come, that she would live here, that Henry's home would extend to include her, left Elias momentarily speechless. It was a generosity so unexpected, so far beyond their original arrangement, that he struggled to comprehend it. "Henry," he said finally, using the older man's first name for the first time, "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't," Henry replied simply. "Just finish this courtyard so I can enjoy my morning coffee here before winter returns." The courtyard was completed in late July, a triumph of design and persistence. They held a small gathering to celebrate. Henry's academic friends, contractors who had worked on the project, even Javier, who whistled appreciatively at the transformation. "Damn, my friend," he said to Elias, "you've been hiding your talents. This is beautiful." Catherine from BAC brought a colleague, the department chair, who asked detailed questions about Elias's design decisions and nodded approvingly at his answers. "We should discuss having you present this as a case study for our preservation course," she said. "It's an excellent example of sensitive modernization within a historical context." As the evening wound down and guests departed, Henry and Elias found themselves alone in the courtyard, now softly lit by the fixtures Elias had carefully positioned to highlight the plantings and fountain. "I've been meaning to discuss something with you," Henry said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd selected for the space. "A business matter." Elias sat across from him, curious. "What kind of business matter?" "I'm not getting any younger," Henry began, his tone matter-of-fact. "This house requires constant attention, as we've both discovered. When I'm gone, it will need someone who understands its quirks, who appreciates its history." "Henry, let me finish. My nephews have no interest in this place. They live in California, hate the Boston winters, and would sell it without a second thought. The idea of developers carving it into condominiums." He shuddered slightly. "In my will, as it currently stands, I've left provisions for you to remain here for a period of 5 years after my death, rent-free, to complete your education and establish yourself professionally. Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's incredibly generous. It's not generosity, it's practicality, Henry insisted. But I've been reconsidering. Instead, I'd like to establish a trust that would transfer ownership of the house to you, with certain conditions. Elias stared at him in shock. Ownership? Henry, no, I couldn't possibly. The conditions? Henry continued as if Elias hadn't spoken. Would be as follows. First, that the historical integrity of the house be maintained. Second, that the trust provide for any necessary major repairs. And third, that a portion of the house, I'm thinking the second floor, be dedicated to housing international students or professionals in architecture or related fields who might otherwise struggle to afford Boston's absurd rental market. He leaned forward, his pale blue eyes intense. In essence, a continuation and expansion of our current arrangement. A place where talent isn't wasted due to circumstance. Where people like you, like your sister, can find their footing in this country. Elias struggled to find words. The proposal was overwhelming. Not just the material value of the house, which must be considerable, but the trust Henry was placing in him. I don't know what to say, he managed finally. Say you'll consider it, Henry replied. That's all I ask for now. Consider whether you could see yourself as the guardian of this house and the purpose I'm suggesting for it. That night, Elias lay awake for hours, thinking about Henry's proposal. It was far more than a job offer. It was a legacy, a responsibility, a life path he had never imagined for himself. Could he do it? Become the caretaker not just of a historic home, but of a mission to support others like himself? He thought of his first day in Boston, standing in the cold with other day laborers, hoping to be chosen. He thought of the countless immigrants he'd met, brilliant people reduced to survival jobs, their talents and dreams deferred or abandoned. He thought of Miriam, and how different her path might be with the support Henry was offering. The answer, he realized, was already clear in his heart. In the morning, he found Henry in the kitchen, preparing coffee with his usual methodical precision. I've considered your proposal, Elias said. Henry looked up, his expression carefully neutral. And I accept with gratitude and humility, but I have one condition of my own. Oh, Henry's eyebrow arched. And what might that be? That you plan to stay around for many more years. Elias said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. This house still needs both of us. A slow smile spread across Henry's face, transforming it with unexpected warmth. That, Mr. Nazari, is a condition I am happy to accept. 1 year later, on a crisp September morning, Elias stood at Boston Logan Airport, his heart pounding with anticipation. Beside him, Henry waited with unusual patience, leaning on his cane, his eyes fixed on the arrival gate. When Miriam finally appeared, Elias barely recognized the confident young woman who had replaced his little sister. She spotted them immediately, her face lighting up with joy as she rushed forward, dropping her bags to throw her arms around Elias. You're here, he whispered in Farsi, holding her tightly. You're really here. I'm here, she agreed, pulling back to look at him through tears. Thanks to you, and she turned to Henry, suddenly shy. Mr. Whitaker, Elias said formally, may I present my sister Miriam Nazari? Miriam, this is Henry Whitaker. Henry extended his hand. Welcome to Boston, Miss Nazari. Your brother has told me a great deal about you, and he has told me everything about you. Miriam replied earnestly, taking his hand in both of hers. How you changed his life. How you gave him a home when he was lost. I have no words to thank you properly. Henry looked momentarily flustered by her directness. Well, no thanks necessary. We have a mutually beneficial arrangement, your brother and I. Miriam glanced at Elias with a knowing smile before turning back to Henry. Of course, mutually beneficial. Still, I hope you will accept my gratitude. As they made their way to the car, Elias watched his sister and Henry fall into conversation about Harvard, about medicine, about Boston's history. Two people from entirely different worlds connected through circumstance and now building a bridge of their own. Later that evening, after Miriam had settled into the guest room, her room now, they gathered in the courtyard for dinner. The space had matured beautifully over the year, the plants thriving, the light changing the character of the entire house, just as Elizabeth had envisioned. Henry raised his glass in a toast. To new beginnings, he said, and to the strange, unpredictable paths that bring people together. To family, Miriam added softly. The ones we're born to and the ones we find. Elias looked between them, his beloved sister and the cantankerous old man who had become so much more than an employer. and felt a profound sense of rightness. From that chance encounter on an icy sidewalk had grown something neither of them could have predicted: a home, a purpose, a future. To unexpected gifts, he said, raising his glass, and the courage to accept them. As twilight deepened around them, the courtyard glowed with warm light, a sanctuary they had created together, a physical manifestation of the transformation that had occurred in all their lives. Through the glass roof above, the first stars of evening became visible, distant points of light bearing witness to the human capacity for connection across all boundaries of age, culture, and circumstance. In that moment, Elias understood with perfect clarity that his life had been forever changed, not just by a job offer, but by an act of faith. Henry's in him, and his in the possibility that extending a hand to help an old man on an icy night could lead to his own salvation.